back, everybody. This is another Working Brother Talks. This time, we've even got our jacket on for Nebojša Malić, an independent journalist coming to us from the US. And he's actually originally from Serbia, is that correct?
Bosnia specifically today, but yes.
All right. Tell us more about yourself. Who are you, and what have you seen in your vast career of, journalism?
So I was originally born in Sarajevo in the late 70s. I was about 15 when the war in Bosnia started. Ended up working the last year of the conflict as a translator for a variety of news agencies, newspapers, televisions, radios. And after the Dayton Accords, I ended up coming to the US on a scholarship, where I often joked that I was being groomed to be a good Soros NGO agent, but that sort of fell through when the interdimensional rift opened in 1999 and the so-called Kosovo War began.
Interdimensional rift, huh? Is that what you refer to it as?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is like a. By the way, my show is a comedy show. This is like the worst comedy show on YouTube. So like you're off to a good start. But that's for the censors, obviously, and for the YouTube algorithm. But yeah, no, realistically speaking, the dimensional rift. So this is another running question that I have for most of my guests. Do you think that World War III started then?
As a trained historian, if I were writing the history books, I would definitely put it in the Spanish Civil War prior to World War II category. I guess in the mind of some American planners who wrote books about it later, they were saying that it was the whole thing wasn't really about Albanians at all. It was a message to Russia. And unfortunately for them, the message seems to have been received loud and clear, because that started the chain of events that led to the present situation. So, yeah, I suppose it could be seen as a precursor, but it certainly took a long time to unspool.
When you say present situation, you mean like the conflict in Ukraine or the SMO, so to say?
Right. Well, I mean, the conflict in Ukraine that started in 2014, but the current special military operation, yes.
And do you think there are any parallels? Because I've discussed with some other guests that we've had, like historians and so on. How do you see parallels between what happened in Croatia, for example, with the Serbian population and the cleansing that happened there, and Operation Storm, or Oluja as it's called, and the parallels of the operation that was planned for the Donbass that the SMO basically stopped?
Well, I don't have to speculate about it. I have documented on multiple occasions in some of my articles, but it's also been reported before the great media blackout and retcon of 2022, that the Ukrainian authorities established after the Maidan coup had literally planned this. One of the key advisors to President Poroshenko, by the name of Lutsenko, if I remember correctly, was basically saying we should do what Croatia did, create a powerful army and then just sweep them off in a week with American help. And I'm paraphrasing because it's an auto translation of his Facebook post, but this was back in 2015. This was after Minsk and everything. And they literally, and this is the guy, by the way, who ended up becoming the top prosecutor a couple of years later, which, as we all know, cannot be done without the blessing of the American government. And Joe Biden personally. So
when you say prosecutor, you mean in Ukraine?
Right.
The prosecutor in Ukraine. Yeah.
Right. So again, like for people to pretend that this was not, that his position was somehow not known or an aberration is simply ludicrous. I mean, this was, this, and when Poroshenko says, well, I only signed Minsk so we can build up an army, this is what he's talking about. When Merkel and Hollande say, oh, yeah, we signed.
I was just going to say, yeah.
Right. This is what they're talking about. This was, and in fact, my specialty thesis, the one that I'm one of the few voices that has put forth in reference to the whole conflict, is that the West the US and its allies, are basically running the Yugoslavia script on Russia right now. The sanctions, all the rhetoric about brutal, violent, unprovoked aggression. This is literally a sequel, not even a sequel, a reboot of what they were doing in the early 1990s.
A really
Except
bad
that,
remake.
I know. Well, that's what Hollywood is today. It's all bad remakes. Have you tried watching any out of it lately?
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Both about the attack on Russia as compared to Serbia, and about the remakes of Hollywood. They're both terrible. But realistically speaking, Russia is not Serbia or Yugoslavia as it was called then. I was a child, basically. I was in my teens during the breakup of Yugoslavia. So I remember watching. We lived abroad, and I remember watching, reports from the day of, Jamie Shea and all these other names that will be imprinted into the back of my head forever. Lying basically nonstop. Speak to the development, or the how the info war, so to say, or the propaganda battle has increased since the 90s to today. Like how especially considering you're in the media, you can probably speak to it a lot better than I can.
Well, the media, the propaganda war against the Serbs in the 90s is something that I discovered after the fact, because as it was going on here, I wasn't here.
Mm-hmm.
And only when I came over in 96 and saw it firsthand in 99 did I get a glimpse. And then, of course, I looked it up in the archives, and, before the internet was a thing, and was just
Mm-hmm.
appalled at these accounts of the events in Bosnia that I witnessed firsthand that were just completely different.
Yeah.
And this entire narrative was just completely different than, I mean, it's one of those, well, who are you going to believe, your lying eyes or CNN? And
Mm-hmm.
then what's happening here is about, let's say, 3 orders of magnitude bigger or nastier, or however you want to call it. It's basically the sheer scope of denying reality is off the charts, because in the intervening years, you've had this doctrine develop that the Imperial America is creating reality by its willpower, and everybody else is just reacting to it. This is the infamous reality-based community quote from like 2004, when
Mm-hmm.
a New York Times journalist was interviewing somebody in the White House.
Yeah.
Some people say it was Karl Rove. Karl Rove denies it was him. I don't know if he's clever enough to have formulated it that way, but it doesn't matter. The point is, whoever said it, this particular way of thinking represents the American ruling establishment. Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
Republicans, it doesn't make a slightest bit of difference. They believe that they can shape reality with literally words.
Yeah.
They say something and that becomes reality. And that's how they function. Now, dating myself a little bit, I used to play real-time strategy games in the early
So did
90s,
I.
in a more carefree
So
existence.
so did I.
Command
Which
and Conquer,
games?
Red Alert. Right.
Exactly. We're living in Red Alert. I was just talking to one of the subscribers about that the other day, and basically, like, you remember when we were playing Red Alert as children, and there was the little pickup vans and the terrorists, or you could be the Chinese or the Americans or the Russians, and that's it. That's all you could be. And when in the, like, let's say early 2000s or mid 2000s, the jihadis showed up on the world stage with their pickups, I was like, wait a second, this is the actual game that we were playing as children.
Well, there's another aspect to it. So in those games, you had the good guys, the Global Defense Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with these highly technological wonder weapons, and the Brotherhood of Nod was the mind-bending, lying, deceiving villains. And in Red Alert, you had the Soviets in the alternate history also
Mm-hmm.
doing the whole mind control experiments. And now we have the situation where the West, the collective West, the US and its allies, are obsessed with highly engineered wonder weapons and basically relying on mind control to achieve their goals. And I'm like, wait a second. If
Wait,
you're
what do you mean
doing the
mind
mind control stuff,
What do you mean mind control? You mean like propaganda, or you mean like
right?
MK Ultra, which is also true?
Well, I mean, I'm not going so far as to say there's somebody like Yuri, mind
So
controlling
just
people literally.
Mockingbird. So just Project Mockingbird you're talking about.
But it's one of those, if your entire approach is based on narrative control, and if you're trying to shape public opinion and create reality through manipulating the news by censoring information you dislike and propagating false information that contributes to your cause, you're engaging in a form of mind control. And my whole point is that if you're doing this, aren't you the villain of your own game? Like these are people who don't have enough self-awareness to realize that they've turned into the villains from their own video games.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely true. Tell us a bit else about what you think of the Ukraine situation. How do you see the recent Chinese statements about that peace plan? How do you interpret that?
So I think the Americans are making the same mistake with China as they made with Trump. They're taking their statements literally, but not seriously, as opposed to seriously, but not literally. Wiser men than me have basically said that the format of the Chinese proposal, accompanied by this position paper called The Problems of US Hegemony, essentially amounts to back in the ancient times of imperial China, the emperor, who was considered to have the mandate of heaven, would declare war by issuing a proclamation that accused the enemy of violating heavenly harmony. And this Chinese proclamation that was published separately from the peace proposal essentially accused the United States and its allies of violating heavenly harmony and violating the global order.
Wait, so
I'm not saying
there's actually two documents, not like the media reports just the 12-point peace plan, right?
The 12-point peace proposal for Ukraine, I think, was intended to be not plausible
Clickbait?
but basically it was a
Clickbait?
limited hangout. Right. Well,
Okay.
no,
What's a limited hangout? Educate the viewers what a limited hangout is.
In American jargon, a limited hangout is when you confess to one small thing to distract from the big thing that's in the background, to cover for something that you want to keep hidden or misdirected from. So, for example, when the American press was talking about how it was the Ukrainians who assassinated Daria Dugina, but it was totally not with the help of the Americans, who had nothing to do with it. That revelation came ahead of the attack on the Crimean Bridge, which was, according to the Russians, planned with American help.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So limited hangout. You confess to one thing so you don't get blamed for something else that you're covering up for. It's perhaps the wrong expression to use for this, because all the eyes were on the Chinese peace proposal or platform or roadmap or however they called it, which the Russians basically said, well, thank you, but no thank you, because these are our conditions. And it's interesting that this was the pretext for them to reveal their conditions for negotiating.
Yeah.
They actually laid out what they want for negotiations to start. And it's not just the four regions or whatever, it's other things. But it was an interesting little, okay, well, thank you for your statement. Here's our statement. And they complement each other. And meanwhile, the Chinese have put forward this position paper that's literally saying that the United States and its allies are a threat to global order because of their hegemonic behavior and violating rules and laws and everything else. And this is the paper that almost nobody's looking at, because their attention is elsewhere. And
go on.
Well, and then you have the instinctive response of the collective West with, NATO saying, well, China has no credibility because they haven't condemned Russia. I'm like, wait a second. So basically, for you to regard anybody as having any credibility, they have to be on your side from the start.
Well,
Well,
yeah,
nice of you to tell us,
you're
I
either with
guess.
us
But
or with the terrorists. Isn't that what
right,
Bush said?
right, and it's again, this is one of those that nothing changes, doesn't matter which party's in power. So essentially, the Western reaction to this only validated the Chinese position paper, and they were either too stupid or too arrogant, or maybe both, to realize that that's how they played themselves. And now for the rest of the world, which is actually paying attention and not to CNN, they're validating Chinese position.
And what do you make of Lukashenko's visit to China?
Lukashenko is a bit of an enigma. I think he's trying to preserve Belarus as so it doesn't become a client state of the West. There was an attempted coup against him in 2020, another one of those October 5th color revolutions that unfortunately we Serbs know so well, and he survived that. And he's
Wait,
been
wait. When you say we know so well, we should maybe elaborate on the fact that Otpor and that, what is it called, canvas, was
right.
basically designed and prototyped in
Right.
Belgrade.
Well, Serbia was the prototype for the color revolution template that's been used around the world ever since. This was
Speak
October
speak to
2000.
that.
This
Yeah.
was right. So I'll just be really brief. So when the Kosovo War failed to achieve NATO's objective of regime change, because that was one of their victory conditions, and they didn't get that at the end, they moved to war by different means and basically sent literally suitcases of cash to opposition activists in Serbia itself, created this narrative about how Slobodan Milosevic's government was unpatriotic for doing what they wanted it to do, which is to allow NATO troops into Kosovo. Don't try to logic this your way out of this, because it's not designed to be logical. It's designed to punch buttons, triggering people's feelings. And they
Yeah.
got people out into the streets to basically use that to overthrow the government. And the techniques that were used for this particular coup were later named color revolutions. And 4 years later in Kiev, you had the Orange Revolution. And a
Hmm.
Guardian reporter that I used to work with in Bosnia had literally written a piece, which is still available in their archives, saying, this is what the US has developed a technique for winning other countries' elections using the Serbia template. I'm paraphrasing from memory. And
Yeah.
and he explained how the entire Serbian scenario was played out in Kiev to bring Yushchenko into power and overthrow Yanukovych the first time, and bring that whole cabal into, and that was supposed to be the original Ukrainian anti-Russian revolution, except that particular group of people was so inept that they managed to get themselves thrown out of office in the next election, which is why the 2014 Maidan ended up happening more violently, in order to get a government literally put together by Victoria Nuland. And again, people who don't know these names, they really need to look this stuff up, because I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. So basically, what you're telling me is I'm not crazy to feel the deja vu feeling as soon as this thing started in 2014.
Not at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, yeah. There's too many parallels to cover in one segment. Maybe we can do a series on it later, considering it is kind of your expertise. But I wanted to get into first of all the spiritual side of the conflict, in the sense that there's dark forces, as I referred to them in another interview, fighting against the Slavic world. Let's put it that way. Like from the 90s, there has been effort through Serbia and Yugoslavia then to get to the Russian-centric world. And maybe you can speak a little bit first to the Ukrainian church and the Montenegrin church, because I'm sure you're very aware of what's going on there, and or has been going on, I should say, for a while. And also, how should I say, you can maybe line that up with some of the deliberate attacks on civilians that we saw in the 90s, you know, the bombing of markets with cluster bombs and so on, and the tactics that are used by the NATO-sponsored forces in Ukraine these days.
So those are two separate topics, but let me address the first one. Let me address the second one first. So the you have this terror bombing of civilians that Ukrainian military is complaining that they don't have enough ammunition.
You cut out for a second. Hello? Are you there? No, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. I can't hear you. You muted yourself. Yeah, no. Are we gonna have to call back? We might have to call back. Technical difficulties. Let's see what happens. Can we get... Yeah. We're waiting. He says wait on a bit. Oh. Okay. Now we've got Nebojša has lost his video. So yeah, just to keep you guys entertained in case we do get connected again. Oh, there's Nebojša. Can you hear me? I can hear you, but no, I can't hear you. Okay, yeah. Call me back. All right. Let's see if we can get this done live while we're recording. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey, I can hear fine.
Well, I'm still recording. So like,
Okay.
we're doing this live on the go.
Okay.
Excellent.
Sorry about that.
So basically, yeah, no worries. You probably had. I'm guessing you had like another call come in.
Yeah. I had turned on do not disturb. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
So where was I?
We were talking about the deliberate bombing of civilians and the lack of ammunition for Ukraine and how that doesn't deter them from bombing civilians.
Right. So no matter how hard up on ammunition they are, they always have more. They always have enough to target civilians in Donetsk and basically terrorize the people they've denounced as separatists and Russian scum and whatever ever since 2014.
Mm-hmm.
This, in my mind, is an analog to, let's say, 1944, and the Germans, never having enough for the front, but always having enough to launch V1 and V2 rockets against London.
Yeah.
That's one parallel that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
The other,
I think the bombing of Belgrade is another good parallel.
Well, the terror bombing of civilians as a Nazi tactic is definitely, and then you realize that the Western allies have done the same thing for pretty much the same reason, except that they got away with it because they're the designated good guys and they wrote the history. And then they dare accuse the Soviets of war crimes, is another one of those things of when you start working in the field of history and you realize how much of it has been glossed over or retconned or altered or redacted to serve modern political narratives.
Omitted and obfuscated, yeah.
Right. Because history has been turned into a weapon, and arguably it's always been. That's one of those things of when you live through a lot of history, you realize how maybe it's always been that way, and things weren't so clear cut even in before times. But when it comes to so speaking of history, let's address the whole subject of the church schisms and ethnogenesis, so to speak, of
ethnogenesis
in both Ukraine
Newspeak.
and Yugoslavia.
You're versed in Newspeak. I like it.
Oh no, I mean ethnogenesis is a very, very legitimate Greek word. It's
no, I know, but I would label it something else, But ethnogenesis is the Newspeak politically correct term, I guess. Yeah.
So, when you look at present day Ukraine, and you look at first of all, Yugoslavia, as put together by Tito in 1945, was the template he used was the Soviet Union, Lenin's Soviet Union specifically, with the whole national policy, and Russians were bad and everybody else had to be bolstered at their expense, and so on and so forth. Stalin had done some reversal of that right before the war, which is arguably the only thing that kept the Soviet Union together, but that's a separate subject for a different time. The point is that Tito's outlook on Yugoslavia was very Leninist. This was the infamous 1928 Dresden Congress of the Communist Party, where they wanted to carve up the country. And when the Axis invasion actually did that in 1941, they were initially perfectly fine with it because, again, Molotov-Ribbentrop was in effect. That suited their goals. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union was invaded in July 1941, all of a sudden the Nazis became the enemy, and there was a whole movement to fight against them in Yugoslavia, but there was no articulated idea of what it was supposed to be because the Dresden conclusions of partition were still a thing. And what they ended up doing in the end is partitioning it internally and creating these republics and then retconning these nations to fit them. And this is how we ended up with Montenegrins being a separate nation, where they've historically always considered themselves Serbs, the Serbiest of the Serbs, so to speak. But this, the kleptocrat that has run this place for, as long as I've been alive, has basically reinvented himself as some, anti-Serb. I know
you're talking about Milo Djukanovic, yeah?
Right. Djukanovic is back in the 90s. He claimed to be this great Serbian nationalist, who wants to march on Dubrovnik and annex Herzegovina and so on and so forth. And now he's done a complete heel turn, and he's basically saying, "Oh no, we've never been Serbs," and he's essentially talking like a Croatian Ustasha from World War II. And the Montenegrin identity he's propagating and he's trying to impose by force is essentially this just as violently anti-Serb as modern Croatian identity, which is based on there were several identities for people living in those territories under Austria-Hungary. And in the 19th century, the one that triumphed was the one that the government in Vienna was least concerned about or most happy with, which was a militantly Catholic, violently anti-Serb ideology that would later be adopted by the Ustasha regime in 1941-45.
Just to clear up for some of the folks who might not be familiar, when the Nazis came to the territory of Yugoslavia and found out what the Ustaše were doing, much like with the Banderites in Ukraine, even the Nazis were horrified at what was being done to the local Serb and the Jewish and other populations.
Imagine being the SS and being appalled at somebody's atrocities. This is how bad these guys were. But this is essentially the ideology that underpins Croatian identity, unfortunately for Croatians. But basically, to be a Croat is to be violently anti-Serb. And this is one of their problems. But again, this was an identity ideology nurtured by Austria-Hungary. Now, which is the imperial power that controlled present-day Western Ukraine, Galicia, at the time? Austria-Hungary. The current Ukrainian flag was the flag of a Ukrainian regiment, of a Galician regiment in the Austro-Hungarian military. Essentially, it was the Austria-Hungary that promoted and nurtured this idea of a separate Ukrainian nation with a separate language that was totally unrelated to Russia and was the true heir of Kiev and Rus and so on and so forth. And essentially I think it's one of the great ironies of history that Gavrilo Princip's, there was a famous poem he carved into the wall of his dungeon before he died, that, our shadows will haunt the courts of Vienna and haunt the spirits of Austrian gentry and so forth. What the problem with the world today is that essentially it's being haunted by the specter of Austria-Hungary. Because what Austrians seeded back then with promoting like they were also behind creating this Albanian identity that ended up being adopted by the Natural Albania, Greater Albania movement. They were behind setting up a Bosniak nation in Bosnia. They, I've already said they promoted this anti-Serb Croatian identity at the expense of pro-Serb ones. And so we have a situation in which, and they also ended up promoting the anti-Russian Ukrainian identity, not to mention, stuff in Poland. Like Poland's on a bit of a side note.
Yeah,
Poland's always fascinated me because Poland ended up being partitioned between Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia, later Germany. And yet modern day Poles exclusively have historical hatred for the Russians, even though the Polish state that ended up being recreated was recreated on the territories formerly held by the Russian Empire. Something like North Macedonia, because the Ottoman Macedonia was partitioned after the Balkan Wars between Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia. And yet the only Macedonia that Macedonian nationalists are talking about is the one that used to be part of Serbia, that was carved up as a separate entity by Tito. They're not asking for land in Greece or Bulgaria, and I wonder why not, because Greece and Bulgaria have basically completely obliterated any figment of Macedonian identity in their territories. But again, you got to kind of go back into history to see where these things come from. So so far you've been talking about identities not tied to religion, but now go back and tie that all to the church that we were going to get into. Right. So I just recently wrote a piece about the anniversary of the Bosnian War, and
Bosnian War, which happened in 95, 95 we're talking about Bosnian War.
Well, this was specifically referring to events of 1992 because the anniversary of that is coming up. But in it, I mentioned that basically all of the people who lived in Bosnia at that time spoke a language they later would call different names, but they differentiated themselves ethnically through religion. Basically, as foreign conquerors came and went, segments of the population identified with them and took on their religion, which is the case with, for example, Bosnian Muslims, and is the case with Bosnian Catholics, who were later classified as Croats. You have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the most Catholic one. And so you have, and after they left, you ended up having communism, which banned religion as a thing and enforced this notion of brotherhood and unity, which would be called diversity, equity, and inclusion in the West today. And it just papered over the differences and enforced this moral equivalence without resolving any of the conflicts. And once that evaporated, you had communities that literally would rather fight with external support than negotiate and find a way to live together, or even segregated. And that was the root of the Bosnian conflict. Now, religion is, when you don't have language to fall back on, religion is another pillar of ethnogenesis that these social engineers use. So in Ukraine, in Yugoslavia specifically, religion was forbidden. But when the country was dismembered, you had these, during the Ustasha regime in the 40s, for example, they tried to set up the Croatian Orthodox Church, which was a fake church governed by the Ustasha government. Because having the Serbian Orthodox Church was unacceptable, they denied the existence of the Serb identity. They actually called the Serbs that they were genociding Eastern schismatics. They refused to even give them their name. So they tried setting up the Croatian Orthodox Church, which didn't take. Milo Đukanović in Montenegro tried doing the same thing because he's following the same script, obviously, and he tried to create the Montenegrin Orthodox Church in order to take over the Serbian Orthodox Church's property, faithful, etc. Just basically do a complete identity replacement operation. That hasn't taken so far. In fact, one could argue that the principal leader of the movement that threw his party out of power a couple of years back, even though he remained president, was triggered by his crackdown on the Serbian Orthodox Church, which then led popular demonstrations and processions against him.
Yeah.
What happened? Right. But here's the other thing. Orthodoxy, unlike Catholicism, doesn't have a pope. The Orthodox Church, after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, ended up being a collection of regional, not national churches, because the concept of nationhood wasn't really known at the time, but each kingdom had its own patriarch and local church. The Serbs have had theirs since the late 13th century. And they are in communion with each other, mostly, but they don't have a pope. Well, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who used to be, there were 4 patriarchs of ancient Orthodoxy in Antioch, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Alexandria in Egypt. The Patriarch of Constantinople used to be considered not first among equals during the Eastern Roman Empire, but again, that hasn't been the case for almost 700 years. And the current patriarch, well, those patriarchs have been sort of non-entities since the declaration of the Turkish Republic, because they don't, after the great ethnic cleansing of Greeks and Armenians in the 1920s, they don't have their flock. They're shepherds without a flock, and they sort of sit in their palace in Istanbul and serve as a decoration. And the current patriarch has allowed himself, whether he chose or whether he was pressured into it, I'm not getting into that, to be instrumentalized as a tool of Western policy. And
I can't remember the patriarch's name. Can you remember his name?
Bartholomew.
Bartholomew, there you go. Yeah, just for people to be able to follow if they need to check the details, so they know that all of this is documented. These are...
Right. So Patriarch Bartholomew essentially participated in this push a year or two ago to declare the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a separate entity, because you had the Ukrainian church as a regional church, but it was in communion and subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchy, which, we call it a Russian Orthodox Church, but that's, you have the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, one outside of Russia, very complicated. Point is, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was in communion with Moscow and was seen as like a province of the Russian church. And there's been a push to make it separate, its own national church, which is not how Orthodoxy really works, by Westerners with the help of Bartholomew. And then on top of it all, you had the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is another one of those NGOs set up at a police station, as the joke used to be about the Montenegrin quasi-church, that was set up by the Poroshenko government.
Just to be clear, the joke is based in reality.
Well, of course.
Because the Montenegrin church was actually registered in a police station. Yeah, right. Just to be clear. Yeah.
So
comedy show.
I mean, we live in clown world. What do you want, man?
Exactly.
But using this Montenegrin recipe, they tried to set up a state church in Ukraine that would take over. And it's just like that Monty Python joke, you have the People's Front of Judea and the People's Liberation Front of Judea and the Judean People's Liberation Front, and all of these, rival resistance movements fighting who's the true resistance. But this is not funny, because in Ukraine, you have the government-owned fake church trying literally to usurp the properties of the canonical church that has even denounced Moscow and denounced this whole conflict as an unjust invasion, but that's not helping them, because the Kiev government doesn't care. They want to take it over. They want to turn its properties over to the state-controlled church so they can have their own state religion, which is a Western thing. It's a thing of Western Reformation, specifically started with Henry VIII in England, and it ended up being a feature of the Westphalian Peace that ended the 30 Years' War. So you basically have state religions, and that's not how Orthodoxy works. I'm not an Orthodox scholar. I know enough to make this particular argument, and if you press me on the specifics of theology, I would have to refer you to experts. But I know enough to know that this is not an Orthodox thing. It's a Western template being forced onto these people as a process of ethnogenesis. And again, trying to create the Ukrainian nation using the conflict and trying to position them as violently anti-Russian, and burning Russian books, and punishing people who are speaking Russian, whether by issuing them fines or tying them to flagpoles and beating them, is, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I was reading in accounts of how the Ustash operated in the 1940s. The first thing the Austro-Hungarian occupation did in 1915 was ban Cyrillic. First thing that the Croatians did was ban Cyrillic in World War II. This is the kind of thing that functioned. I'm shocked, actually, that the Ukrainian government hasn't proposed switching to Roman alphabet just yet. But I guess they're trying to do this one step at a time.
I saw a screenshot or a meme. I'm not sure it was real or fake, but it could be real. That's what's funny, is that somebody in Poland went to study Ukrainian classes, just like to learn the language, and the whole class was full of Ukrainians.
It wasn't a joke. Apparently, Duolingo reported that the most popular second language being learned in Ukraine in February, March 2022 was Ukrainian.
Yeah. So we live in clown world.
Well, and that's the thing. Like back in the early 90s, so before Yugoslavia fell apart, the language known as Serbo-Croatian, that politically was agreed and scientifically was agreed to being the language spoken from Slovenia to Macedonia, was mutually intelligible. It had local variants, it had local dialects, it had local expressions, but you had a range of official canon accepted and was mutually intelligible. And then in 1990, when Croatian nationalists came to power, they started inventing their own words. And we used to joke about it. I mean, I was old enough in 1990 to remember that, rather than saying belt, they would say something like round the stomach, pants upholder, or some such nonsense. Yeah. And we laughed at it. It was funny. It was a joke. But they've literally...
I remember that.
Correct. But since then, they've adopted this kind of nonsense into an official language. And they insist on these expressions, and they insist on trying to make it as different from Serbian as it could possibly be, because, as I said before, it's part of the whole identity building.
Again, I don't know how true this is, but I heard that they have like a prize for the best new Croatian word every year. They do.
It's a thing.
So,
it's totally a thing.
Yeah.
Now, here's the funniest part of it all is when I started learning Russian some years back, I was struck by how many Russian words the Croatians had appropriated as their own. And for, a violently Catholic nation that denies Orthodoxy the right to exist, they sure don't mind, looting the heritage of other Orthodox nations as their own in order to just not be Serbs. But that's a whole separate conversation there. It's just funny, it's one of those, there's no logic in this. As soon as you understand the logic of power, that one explains everything. There's no other logic at play.
Okay, we've covered Montenegro, we've covered Ukraine a bit, we've covered Macedonia even, and Croatia. Tell us about Bosnia, considering you said you were from Bosnia originally.
Right.
Tell us about the 90s and the jihadis in Bosnia and Osama bin Laden and Oric.
So, I never saw.
Tiny topic. Just what you can in passing.
5 minutes. So there were multiple reporters claimed to have seen Osama bin Laden in Sarajevo. I never saw him. I was sort of impressed into government service in 1995 as somebody who was on the Muslim side of town, got caught there when the war started, and spent the war there. But I've seen jihadists with my own eyes. I've seen, people who were supposed to be Turks who didn't speak Turkish, who had
Before they were
beards
called
and
jihadists,
turbans.
for the record. They were called mujahideen then, right?
Right.
They weren't...
Well, Mujahideen being the soldiers of God moniker from Afghanistan. There was actually a unit, a battalion or a brigade called Al Mujahideen that operated in central Bosnia. That was sort of a precursor of these Ukrainian Foreign Legion things. Essentially, Brendan O'Neill did a fantastic piece back in 2008. Oh my God, has it been 15 years? When Radovan Karadzic was arrested and extradited, he wrote this lengthy essay on hysteria politics and the root of global jihad, in which he mentioned how when the war in Afghanistan ended in 1992 with the overthrow of Najibullah and the Soviet-backed government, these jihadists, both Afghan and foreign jihadists, who fought against him with American help, well, they found themselves without a purpose, with nowhere to go. Okay, their war was done. Well, what now? They can't just go home and tend their crops and whatever, raise their camels and go back to the family construction business in case of Osama bin Laden. So they needed another cause. They needed another cause, and basically the U.S. propaganda about the Bosnian War, about how it was the evil Serbs genociding innocent peaceful Muslims for no reason whatsoever, and the West was morally defective because it didn't intervene militarily. That propaganda was intended for Western consumption. It was intended to shame the Western public into supporting military intervention for which it didn't really have a stomach at the time, because the Cold War was over. Everybody wanted a peace dividend. The Iraq War was sort of the first Iraq War was seen as a, okay, fine, glorious ending of the old order. We can now live in peace. And basically the Western public needed to be led by the nose into supporting this whole American empire experiment. And they used the propaganda about Bosnia to do that. The problem for them and for us was that this kind of propaganda resonated in the Muslim world, where they had already read the treatise by Ali Izetbegovic written in the 70s about the need for Islamic revolution. And all of a sudden you had all of these young people who had no jobs, had no prospects, saying, wait a second, the filthy West is standing idly by where our brethren are being wantonly slaughtered by these evil, Christians. Let's go fight a jihad. And you had people first enlisting to go. And one of the top Al-Qaeda lieutenants actually ended up losing, I believe, his eye and his hand in the fighting. I forget which one it was now. Their names sort of unfortunately all blend together because they all take these pseudonyms, and not even from their scriptures, but from that movie about Under the Banner of the Prophet, or The Message, or however it was translated, that was made in the 80s. But everybody's Abu Hamza. But essentially, so you had people who went there to fight in the jihad, and you had other people who sympathized and tried to join, or went to Chechnya instead, or essentially ended up being radicalized by this Western propaganda, and then turned on the West once the Bosnian War officially ended in Dayton. You had an explosion of this international jihadist terrorism through Al-Qaeda, and then later on, after the invasion of Iraq, through ISIS. And I'm not saying there's no genuine Islamic radical terrorism, because there obviously is, but a lot of it has been fueled. It's like that meme, who radicalized you? And the answer is CNN did, Christiane Amanpour did, all these lies about the Serbs and the Russians and the wars in Bosnia and the Soviet Union. That's what contributed. Majid Nawaz, a former radical who has gone into anti-radical activism, openly wrote about how he was radicalized, how he joined the Muslim Brotherhood because of the reports of genocide in Bosnia. I mean, I'm not making this up. He wrote about it. Again, Brendan O'Neill's essay, Bosnia Hysteria Politics and the Roots of Global Jihad, I believe it was called, from 2008, is just one of those. Yes, it starts off with a very specific British context, but it develops into this whole examination of this whole phenomenon of global jihadism as fueled by American propaganda about the Serbs and the Russians in the 1990s. Now, the war itself in Bosnia, I have maintained for years that it was not inevitable. It could have been prevented. There were many good people who tried to prevent it. Fikret Abdic tried to negotiate an agreement. The co-founders of the Muslim Nationalist Party, Adil Zulfikar Pashic and Muhammad Filipovic, tried in August 1991. They had negotiated an agreement for Muslims to stay for Bosnia to stay in Yugoslavia, Muslims to be equal partners of the Serbs, have all the equal rights and everything, and there was to be peace. And all the rights of the Croats would be guaranteed because at that point, Croatia was recognized as an independent state. The only issue was how much territory it could claim. The person who I solely blame for the war is Alija Izetbegovic. He's an Islamist. He has always been an Islamist. He was fundraising for the Muslim Waffen-SS during World War II. He did a brief stint in jail for that. The communists were nearly as ruthless.
That's also something worth mentioning about the colorful history of Yugoslavia. Tell us about the Waffen-SS Muslim units.
So, the Mufti of Jerusalem, which was at that point under British occupation, after the riots in 1936, he fled to Nazi Germany. And when the war began, he had this whole fantasy of raising legions of Muslim fighters to fight for the Nazis to liberate their, ancestral lands from the British. And obviously Hitler used them for that purpose. And Himmler apparently had a fascination with Islam in general, and was in his mind, it was one of those esoteric pagan religions like Nordic mythology that he was obsessed with. And
that's conspiracy theory even for me. Even for me, that's conspiracy theory. I didn't know he was fascinated with Islam.
Himmler absolutely had this obsession. I mean, it's all well documented. That's where all these searches
I've never heard of it, but I believe you. Yeah.
This is where Sonnenrad, the current symbol used by the Azov battalion on purpose. They took it from their founder admitted that he took it from the SS.
From the floor,
Right, this was on the floor of a castle that Himmler commissioned. Anyway, so that's sort of a side note, but they encouraged the establishment of the Waffen-SS division in Bosnia, and I believe it was recruited in 1942 or 43. By the time it was operational, it was 43. And there were two divisions. The first one was Hanjar, and the second one was Kama, both types of blades. And Hanjar was raised, both were considered Croatian because Bosnia at the time was part of the independent state of Croatia ruled by the Ustasha. And the Muslims were considered, Muslim Croats or honorary Croats or whatever. It was sort of a weird thing of how a militantly Catholic country would consider Muslims a special privileged population. But as long as they were killing Serbs, that was fine.
Orthodox, preferably. Again, Serbs in general.
Right. So you have the logic of power trumps every other logic. And these two divisions were raised and were operating in Yugoslavia as a sort of a counterinsurgency and engaging in atrocities against civilians and mainly massacring Serbs. And Izetbegovic, who wasn't old enough to join, he was old enough. I believe he was in high school at the time. He basically joined this organization called Young Muslims, Mladi Muslimani, that fundraised, humanitarian aid. Let's get supplies for the Ukrainian Legion. Same concept. And after the war, he was jailed for collaboration, but he spent like 3 years in prison, and he was released in 1949, and was allowed to go to law school. Get a law degree. He worked in construction as a legal advisor for a construction company. He lived his quiet life for about 20 years, and then in 1969, he writes this essay called "The Islamic Declaration." It's a 40-page pamphlet. It basically, and its key point is that Islam is a political ideology, and when Muslims abandoned Islam as a political ideology in favor of secular democracy, socialism, whatever, they went from being empires who ruled the world to colonies of the West. And so the way to return was to return to Islam. And his main claim was there can be no coexistence between Islam and non-Islamic political systems.
Other than
including
fascism.
democracy.
Other than
democracy.
fascism.
Right.
But fascism's okay.
Well, I mean, he would later say that he considered the Handjar division as a way to, Hitler was just going to help us create a, Bosnian Muslim homeland. Just like Stepan Bandera was like, oh, well, I embraced the Nazis because I was fighting for independent Ukraine. I was going to discard them afterwards.
Just like they've recently adopted using ISIS terrorists in Ukraine as well. Yeah, but you've seen that, yeah?
Yeah. The Tatars, the ISIS, whatever helps them fight Russia. It's one of those. The West talks about how terrorism and fascism and whatever, you have these people LARPing in American cities as Antifa, and yet it's the CIA that extracted the Nazis from Europe in Operation Paperclip and gave them jobs in the U.S. government secret research projects and in NATO because they were useful. It's again, power trumps everything else. But let me wrap this up real quick. So Izetbegović, having written this, and this was published in 1991, and yet he goes to the West and says, "Oh no, I'm a tolerant, moderate Democrat, and I want a secular state of all citizens that are not divided by ethnicity." And whether they fell for this or whether they sought to use him, it doesn't really matter in the final analysis, because the last American ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, came and met with Izetbegović in March of 1992 after he had signed an agreement mediated by the UN and the EU, which wasn't quite called the EU at the time, but it was about to be. And they had put together this arrangement, which was awkward but workable, whereas Bosnia would be partitioned in these ethnic provinces, the Serb, Croat, and Muslim, and would be an independent state. So everybody made a concession. The Croats got independence, but they didn't get all of Bosnia next to Croatia. The Muslims got independence, but they didn't get control of the entire country. The Serbs had to accept independence, but they got their own ethnic territory within the country. So everybody, it was a compromise. Everybody got something. Well, Zimmerman talks to Izetbegović. What he said remains a mystery. Some people say he told him, if you don't like it, don't sign it, we'll support you. Zimmerman swore that that's not what he said. I met the Canadian ambassador to Belgrade who basically lived next door to Zimmerman, and he swears that that's true, that Zimmerman did incite.
No, but I'm saying Zimmerman was the negotiator on behalf of the U.S. or
no, he was the U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia at the time.
Okay.
And
I've never heard the name before.
Right. So this is like 2 weeks before the U.S. was recognized Bosnia as an independent state. So basically, Zimmerman comes to Izetbegović on the day. Right after meeting him, Izetbegović says, I'm withdrawing my signature from the agreement and I'm declaring independence of Bosnia. At which point, both the Serbs and the Croats who had signed the agreement were like, wait a second, you're breaking the deal. Within days, he declares independence. Germany and the US lead the way in recognizing Bosnia. And on the day it was recognized, you had roadblocks and you had checkpoints and you had militias, and that's how the war starts.
Yeah.
That's how the war starts. The whole narrative about a greater Serbian aggression is, frankly speaking, bullshit. I was there. I remember. Now, now, why would he do this? Very simple. It took me a little while to put the pieces together, because when you're in the middle of these things, you don't see them, and you're also like 15. But he had very little support among the Muslims in Sarajevo and central Bosnia. His nationalist project didn't have, he came to power, the way he came to power, and I'm going to try to keep this short because I know this is going into too much detail, but the way he came to power was he used Fikret Abdić's popularity as an unjustly persecuted businessman to get votes. He used Zulfikar Pasic's money and Filipovic's academic pedigree to establish his party. And then he imported several thousand, some people say tens of thousands, of Muslims from Serbia, from the region known as Raška, or as the Muslims call it, Sanjak, to be his foot soldiers, to be his muscle. And we were wondering early in the war, why were there so many people speaking with a Serbian accent, clearly Muslims, all around town, and filled with money and selling guns? What was going on? And of course, when the war broke out and these people turned out to be the shock troops, we realized that that's what happened. Now, he relied on them in the first phase, and then he started drafting people. And once the shooting starts, people end up picking sides because they have to. You can't you can't stay neutral. There's people shooting at you, so people ended up enlisting and ended up getting killed, and so on and so forth. But he basically purged the urban Muslim intelligentsia who might have opposed him. And by the end of the war, he had created this narrative that these were purely innocent people for no reason attacked by the evil Serbs and then by the evil Croats and then betrayed by evil Abdic and betrayed by the evil West. And the only true friends were like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
I just want to interject and clue people in, because you say the end of the war, and I know what that means, but like other people might not, because like the wars, quote unquote, in Yugoslavia, or the breakup of Yugoslavia, as it's sometimes referred to, lasted for about 10 years. So when you say the end of the war, yeah.
I'm talking about the end of the war in Bosnia, but I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So 3 years, this thing that lasted 3 years. By year 2, when the Mujahideen started showing up, it had become clear that Izetbegovic had used the war. He wanted war to become the supreme leader. He wanted war to impose his vision of Bosniak nationhood, in which he would be the father of the nation. And we go back to that expression I used before, ethnogenesis. And, instead of this being, a nation invented by an Austro-Hungarian anthropologist in the early 1900s, this became a nation, forged in war and genocide. This is why they're insisting on the whole genocide propaganda. It's based on this horrific misunderstanding of the Holocaust, in which some people in the Muslim world believe that the only reason Israel exists is that they successfully capitalized on the Holocaust to claim victimhood for themselves, and therefore the West is giving them everything. But this is what the Muslim world, some people in the Muslim world believe. This is not my belief. I need to officially make that clear.
Distinction,
so that it doesn't get quoted out of context here. But you literally have some people in Bosnia who want to create their own genocide industry so they would bolster their narrative of nationhood. And essentially, Izetbegovic killed tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims, or got them killed, for his dream of being the father of the nation, and leaving the country to his son, who currently runs his party. And and then his son is like, when he talks to Erdogan in Turkey, he's like, "Oh, my father left you Bosnia as a to care for." I'm like, it wasn't yours to give. The Ottoman Empire left Bosnia in 1878. It's not yours. You can't give it away. It doesn't belong to you. Who the hell do you think you are? Yeah, I'm a little sensitive about this because, this is my patrimony he's trying to give away here. But
definitely, yeah.
So essentially, you had this dynamic at work where at one point, Izetbegovic's Muslims were fighting Serbs, Croats, whom they used to be allied with, but fell away from in 1993, other Muslims, the faction around Fikret Abdic, who tried to make a separate peace with the Serbs, and berating Americans for not being sufficiently supportive. The Americans slide in, and they were using the Bosnian War as their own imperial project to basically muscle out the UN and establish NATO as an intervention force, and basically create the American empire. Richard Holbrooke's memoir is very instructive about this. The man was, and I won't mince the words, a-hole, but he was so arrogant that he was open about it. And he basically, in 1994, they set up this alliance of Croats and Muslims. In 1995, they deploy NATO to bomb the Serbs. They call these negotiations in Dayton, Ohio, and they try to put together a partition map, because every peace proposal included a partition map. And They insist on having Milosevic speak for the Serbs because they had the Bosnian Serbs indicted for war crimes by their pet tribunal, and have the Croatian president speak for the Croats, which is what he has been doing anyway, and have Izetbegovic and his underlings there speak for the Muslims. And they put together this partition plan, and that the Muslims were most keen about percentages of territory and so forth. And there's a famous anecdote in Holbrook's book where Izetbegovic, shuffles from his bedroom in his slippers, looks at the map, and says, "I don't want to sign this." And as Holbrook put it, Warren Christopher, the man who would order Irish coffee without the whiskey, who had never raised his voice in his life, suddenly let out a stream of the vilest curses known to man. He was Secretary of State at the time. And Holbrook basically, brought in Clinton personally on the phone with Izetbegovic to tell him, "Look, if you don't sign this, we're not going to support you anymore." And Izetbegovic says, "Oh, you can't do that. We're the victims. You have to support us." I'm paraphrasing again from Holbrook's paraphrasing. And Clinton said, "Watch me." Because at that particular point in time, this is November 1995, with 1 year before the election, he needed a peace deal in Bosnia. It was in his political interest to score a major foreign policy win, and the 1 year peacekeeper commitment would expire right in time for the election so he could get reelected in 1996. And this is precisely what happened. And what ended up happening was the bribe, to sweeten the deal, the US promised Muslims weapons and training. And this armistice, this peacekeeping mission, was supposed to end in a year. And no doubt some people figured, okay, well, after a year's pause, we're just going to continue the war and end it on our own terms, which meant wiping out the Serbs and taking over the territories they lived on, just like Croatia. Well, that never happened because the peacekeepers ended up staying. The high representative / viceroy ended up staying to this very day. And officially, I think the pretext for this was that some kind of terrorist training camp was found near Sarajevo, and this was the international jihadist problem that they never got rid of.
Wait. I gotta stop you for a second. I've got a little clip here. Let me switch here. We've got France 24 English. Just listen to this.
Bosnia used to import jihadists. Now it exports them.
That's all we needed to hear. Bosnia used to import jihadists, and now it exports them. It's talking about Syria and so on. That area.
That's the irony of it. That the war's been over for almost 20 years, and when it was 95 to 2015 so it was 20 years when ISIS became ascendant in Syria, and all of a sudden you had volunteers from Bosnia who were raised in these Wahhabist Salafist villages that were sort of jurisdictions of their own that were tolerated by the Bosnian Muslim authorities, usually in ethnically cleansed Serb and Croat villages, that were following. This is a form of Islam that's fairly alien to that area. The original Sunni Islam that took root in Bosnia was of the Ottoman variety, not the Arabian kind, but it doesn't matter. And these people frequently clashed with the locals over that too. But you ended up having people volunteering and going to fight with ISIS in Syria. In fact, I believe the most jihadists per capita actually came from Albania and Kosovo. For all of that, all of that story. Oh, we love America. America's great. We have Bill Clinton statue. We have Hillary Clinton statue. We have Madeleine Albright Street, George Bush statue. Okay, well, why are you sending jihadists to ISIS? Death to America.
Don't forget, what? Hold on. I have to talk to the subscribers and the people who are watching. Don't forget to click subscribe, like, share. This is the worst comedy show on YouTube. Don't. Yeah, like it's the only way that I can deal with it too. It's absolutely hilarious. And like you said, Serbia in that time, let's say, or the Serbian people, not the state because it didn't exist then. Oh, you have a cat. Nice. The cat decided to jump in and say hello.
You want to be on TV? Hi, you're on YouTube.
it likes the comedy show.
Yes, he does.
All right. So what was I going to say? Yeah, the Serbian people basically were being attacked on two fronts by different kinds of or different shades of Muslim terrorists. You know, whether they were KLA or whether they were the other more radical kind. Although I don't think one is more or less radical than the other. And I find it unbelievable in Ukraine that the exact same thing is happening, and the same thing happened in Syria, and the same thing happened in Libya, and the same thing is happening everywhere. And that brings me, because we've been going on for an hour and 10 minutes, and I usually don't like to keep it too long, because like then people don't have the time to schedule to watch it. But often in your writing, you use the term GAE, meaning Global American Empire, if I'm not
Globalist
mistaken.
American Empire, yes.
Globalist American Empire. Is it gay? Is the world gay now? Or is it less gay? Is it getting less gay? GAE?
Well, the world is getting less subject to the globalist American empire.
Yeah.
The acronym is not of my creation. I actually borrowed it from
I
an
know.
American writer, Darren Beattie. But I think he meant it as a pun, considering what kind of flags would get displayed on American embassies. I think we're living in although the joke is that on us that we're living in a clown world, I think the world is being less clowny every day. I think forces are in motion, whether we like them or not, that are making it less so every day. That and I think let's put it this way. When this is over, and it could be a year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years, I think the world will be more gay in the traditional English sense of joyful, and less in terms of the globalist American empire.
Well played on words. I like it. I like it. Very, very eloquently said.
We'll see what happens.
Thank you for joining us. It's been a very interesting talk. Do you have anywhere you'd like to point the people towards where they can follow you? The Nebulator on Telegram, we'll link it. But other than that?
Yeah, the easiest, at least once or twice a day I post on the Nebulator, which is a sort of a semi-long form analysis of stuff. I also, for lack of a better word, shitpost on Twitter at Nebojša Malić, shaved Latin. So you can find me there until I get censored. And there you go.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Let's play some music and take it out.